What's up, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of Into the Floo. Today I'm going to talk strictly about gameplay. So I'm going to dive into how to play the game as well as breaking down the different types of cards that you'll find in the Harry Potter trading card game. I'm really excited about it. I hope you guys are too. Let's just dive right in. Okay, I'm going to start by showing the different types of lessons that you can find in this game, as well as the different types of cards. So first, Transfiguration lesson, Creature lesson, Quidditch, Charms, Potions. The different types of cards you can find in this game are location cards, items, characters, adventures, match, creatures, spells. Okay, so I'm going to dive in and show you the steps to play the game. I'm going to use one of my decks as an example. This is a Sprout deck. So that means Professor Pomona Sprout is my starting character. So when choosing a starting character, it's important to note this is a witch. Your starting character has to be a witch or a wizard. So for example, we see Ron Weasley, his says wizard, and Sprout says witch. Now, there are some characters in the game, for example, Filch does not have an indication right here, which means he cannot be a starting character. So your starting character has to be either a witch or a wizard. Again, you'll see that there. It cannot be any character such as Filch. After you shuffle your deck, you will decide who goes first between you and your opponent. People have many ways of doing that, whether it's by rolling the dice, choosing the person who's youngest, oldest, cutest, whatever. And then you just decide. So in this case, I am all of the above since I'm the only human here, and I will go first. So this deck here is a 60 card deck. Every deck that you play with will be 60 cards plus your starting character with a total of 61 cards. 60 being in your deck, the 1 being the starting character. I always have my deck here, and for you to start the game, you draw 7 cards. So you draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Your opponent would then draw 7 cards as well. And that is only at the beginning of the game. That is not at the beginning of every turn. In order for you to start your turn, you draw a card, just 1 card. So to start the game, you've got 7 cards in your hand. This is called your hand. To start the game, you draw 1. Then you get 2 actions. These 2 actions could be used to do multiple things. You could also use both actions to do the same thing. What I mean by that is, you could use one action to play some of the cards that I showed you earlier, such as a lesson card, creature, spell, item, match, or a location. You could also use one action to draw another card in your hand. But if you wanted to play a character or an adventure card, you need both actions for that. So let's say, for example, I've got this hand here, okay? If I wanted to play this lesson, that would only cost me 1 action, so I have 1 more left. Now, in play, I have 2 lessons. Lessons give you the power to play other cards. The reason I have 2 is because Pomona Sprout offers 1. She gives me 1. Nobody can take that. So even if I didn't have this in play, I still had 1 lesson in play. And if I had a card that had a 1 in here, then I would be able to play it, but I don't. So if the first action I use is to play this lesson, that means I have 2 lessons in play. However, that doesn't really help me with this particular hand because each one of these cards requires more than 2 lessons. So I can't play it. Now I do have 2 cards in here that do not require lessons at all. That's the adventure cards. Adventure cards and character cards do not require lessons in order to be put in play. However, they do require 2 actions. So because I used 1 action to play a lesson, I will not be able to play these because I'm only allowed 2 actions per turn. So in this particular case, what I would do for my other action is draw a card. That's the end of my 2 actions, the end of my turn, and now it is my opponent's turn. My opponent, at the very beginning of their turn, to start their turn, they would draw a card. They would then use their 2 actions, again, to play any of those cards that we talked about earlier, or they could use both of their actions to play a character or an adventure, and then their turn would end. Now it's my turn again. So to start the turn, I would draw 1, and I would utilize my 2 actions. Now I've got these cards. I have 1 lesson, so I would use 1 action to play a lesson. Now I have 3 lessons in play. 1, 2, 3. Because I have 3 lessons in play, I would be able to play Umbrella Flowers. Now, the reason I can play Umbrella Flowers, this is a 3 inside of the creature symbol. But the cool thing about the Harry Potter trading card game is that if you have at least 1 of the type of lesson that a card requires in play, you can play that card so long as the rest of them are of a different type. So in this example, Pomona Sprout gives me 1 Care of Magical Creature lesson, and I have 2 other lessons in play. These are Transfiguration, with a total of 3, 1 of them being creature. That means I can play that card. Okay, let's fast forward now and say that we are a few turns into the game now, and this is what my play looks like. These are what the cards that I have in play are. So I've got 2 Mandrake in play, 1 Leaping Toadstool, 1 Umbrella Flowers, and 5 Transfiguration lessons. And of course, my Pomona Sprout always stays in play. She's my homie. So now, the steps of your turn with this particular setup, they don't change, but something is going to be added. Because I have creatures in play, what happens is, the beginning of my turn, I draw a card. My creature cards that do damage to my opponent do damage right now. So what that means is, my Mandrake, damage each turn is 3. Damage each turn is 3. That's a total of 6 damage each turn to my opponent. Now, the objective of the game is to deplete your opponent's deck. So my opponent wants my deck to be 100% depleted, and I want the same thing of my opponent's deck. So by doing damage, that means, let's say, for example, this deck is my opponent's deck. This 6 damage means that my opponent would take 6 cards from their deck and put it into their discard pile. So it's making their deck lesser and lesser each turn, so that hopefully they eventually go to draw a card. There's no cards there. I win the game. That's the objective. So now, on my turn, I draw a card. My creatures that do damage my opponent. Then I do my 2 actions. Again, we talked about the options of doing that. And then my turn would end. Now, if there's a card in play that says, before your turn, do this or that, that would be done before your turn, which means before you draw a card. Now, this is just an example so that we can know what I mean by that. This is a nut. It's an item. It is not in this deck. However, if I had an item like this in play, it says, before your turn, if this card is in play, discard it and you get 1 more action. So that means if this card was in play here and my opponent finishes their turn and it is about to be my turn, I could discard this card for 1 more action. Now, every card that says before your turn, it does something different. So we have to read those. But this one in particular, this nut, before your turn, discard this card and you get 1 more action. So I would do that before. Then I would draw a card. Then I would continue with my 3 actions. And there are also some cards that read, at the end of your turn, do this or that. So you would do that at the end of your turn, and then your turn would be over. So again, if this is what your cards look like that are in play, your opponent would take damage after you draw a card. They would take this amount of damage. Now, let's say I have this in play, and now I'm ready for my 2 actions. I can play a spell using 1 action. This spell is called Swarm, and it reads, count the number of creatures in play, yours and your opponent's, do that much damage to your opponent. So what that means is I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's assume that my opponent is also playing a creature deck and has 4 as well. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, plus theirs that they have in play. That's a total of 8 damage that my opponent would do. After I play a spell card, it goes into the discard pile. It does not stay in play. The cards that stay in play are lessons, creatures, items, matches, locations, adventures, and characters. An adventure, like this one, again, requires 2 actions. And this adventure would be played, it would stay in play until my opponent solves whatever the adventure is telling my opponent to solve. So, for example, this adventure is a pretty popular one because of the brutality of it. And we all like that because we're pretty much savage animals. So the effect is what it does to your opponent. To solve it is what your opponent needs to do in order to get rid of this. And the reward is what your opponent would receive upon completion. So it's always broken up like that. Effect to solve, reward. This one reads, your opponent can't use actions to play any cards except lesson cards. So that sucks because sometimes if you play this, if you time it correctly, and you put this card into play while you're halfway through the game, your opponent may not have many lessons left in their deck or in their hand in order to play it. Some people prepare for this and they constantly keep lesson cards in their hand just in case you have a caught by Snape. We can go through strategies and things like that at a later time, but the average person does not have that many lessons. So this is pretty brutal. To solve it, your opponent uses actions to play lesson cards 3 times. So that means they have to use an action to play a lesson card, another action to play a lesson card, and another one. So that's usually, let's just assume they have 3 lesson cards in their hand right now. That would be 1.5 turns that they would use in order to solve this. The reward reads, your opponent may put any number of lesson cards from his or her hand into play. So if in their hand they have 5 lessons and they use 3 of them to solve this, they could put the other 2 into play if they wanted. So now it only stays in play until they solve it, and then it goes to the discard pile. Your opponent can also get rid of creatures by doing damage to the creature. However, if your opponent plays a spell card that says, for example, do 5 damage to your opponent, it cannot do damage to the creature unless the card specifically says so. So just because you have a annoying mandrake that's constantly doing damage, unless the card says do 5 damage to your opponent or to a creature of your choice or something along those lines, you're not gonna get rid of that creature that's in play. I'm gonna make a note about unique cards. There are some cards that will say unique. For example, this character card, it says character, witch, Hufflepuff, unique. That means only one of these can be in play at a time. So let's say, for example, my starting character as we have it here is Professor Pomona Sprout. And my opponent has their starting character as Snape, for example. But they want to use the Pomona Sprout that is in their deck. They will not be able to play their Pomona Sprout because I have mine in play. The only time that the same character can be in play at once is if it's both of our starting characters. So if my opponent has his or her starting character as Pomona Sprout and I have my starting character as Pomona Sprout, then that is acceptable. But again, if their starting character is not Sprout, then they cannot play the Sprout that is in their deck if they have one in their deck. Many characters come with abilities. Pomona Sprout, for example, says each of your plants has 2 more health. So all of these plants here, the umbrella flowers, the health is 6. However, because I have Pomona Sprout in play as my starting character, it has 8. Leaping Toadstools says 4. It actually is 6. Now, actually all of the characters come with an ability. Professor Snape's, for example, says once per game, you may shuffle up to 7 non-healing cards from your discard pile into your deck. The reason that's a good thing is because, again, the purpose of this game is to deplete your opponent's deck to get it down to 0. So if my opponent is utilizing creatures and spells and I'm doing a lot of damage, meaning I'm taking a lot of cards from my deck into my discard pile and I'm getting closer to losing, I want healing cards like Snape to be able to reverse some of that and take some of the cards in my discard pile and put them back into my deck so that I can get closer to winning and further away from the depletion of my deck. Because it says once per game, that means it can only happen one time. When I use Snape's ability or any of the other characters' abilities, I can no longer use them. So you have to time it correctly, make sure that you understand it's just one time, unless the character specifically reads once per turn, then that means you can utilize it anytime during your turn, each turn. Now, when building a deck, there are some decks that you can find online or within the Revival group that are pretty simple decks. This deck right here is a creature and transfiguration deck. What I do when I think of building a deck is I first choose the type of lessons that I want to use. Many people go about this differently. I'm just telling you my opinion. I wanted to use transfiguration and creature lessons in order to build this deck The unique thing about this deck is it's considered tribal because Pomona Sprout's character is the professor of herbology. So that's why you'll notice in this deck there are a lot of plants. So you have like leaping toadstool, bowtruckles, cobra lily, umbrella flowers. So these are all plants. And then the spells that you'll find are to do extra damage to the opponent. So Steel Claw is a really popular card in creature decks because it says all your creatures do damage to your opponent. So that means I've got these two. That's a total of 6 damage. That is 6 damage in addition to the damage that they took after I drew my card. So when building your deck, you need to keep in mind the type of lessons you want to use. I would start with 20 lessons in your deck. Some people have more, some people have less. You're never going to know how good your deck is until you play. So everything is in theory until you put it into practice, right? So deciding what lessons you want to use and then deciding which cards you want to use. You're allowed 4 of the same card in your deck. With the exception of lessons, of course, you're allowed as many of those as you'd like. Again, going back to the unique cards, only one of them can be in play at a time. So that means you can have 4 sprouts in your deck, but because she's your starting character or one of them is in play, you cannot have her in play. You couldn't play another sprout if you wanted to because she's already in play. Hedwig is another example of that. That's another creature. She is unique. So you can have 4 of them in your deck if you want in order to increase probability of playing her, but you cannot have 4 of them in play. Or 2 for that matter. You couldn't have a Hedwig here and a Hedwig here the way that I have these mandrakes because she's unique. Just keep that in mind when looking at the cards, if they're unique. So again, the steps of your turn, before your turn, if a card tells you to do something, do it now. If it says before your turn, do this, this is when you do it. Then you would draw a card. Your creature cards that do damage your opponent now at this point. Then you use your 2 actions, again, to play a lesson, creature, spell, item, match, location, or you may draw an extra card. Then if you wanted to play a character or an adventure, you would utilize both actions for that. Then if a card tells you to do something after your turn, you would do it at this point after using your 2 actions. Then your turn would be over. Then your opponent would go. Again, the objective of the game is to have a lot of fun, make friends, smile, laugh, talk a little bit of smack, and to get rid of your opponent's deck. Once you do that, you're a pro like the rest of us. All right, everybody, that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave that below. Also follow my Instagram page at Harry Potter Morrissey, and you can feel free to DM me there if you like.